Everybody, welcome back for another episode of Call It RevOps. Today we're going to be talking about a unsung hero in the RevOps community, which is revenue analytics. Today we have Kelsey White, Director of Analytics and Revenue Analytics at G&W Consulting. Kelsey, thank you so much for joining Raja and I on today's podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, as we kick things off, the first question that always kind of comes up, or I think is a good starting place, is what is revenue analytics and how and why does it play into RevOps?
So revenue analytics is realistically, it's the kind of comprehensive understanding of the business impact and strategic growth around, what marketing initiatives, what initiatives in general are driving revenue and leading to positive outcomes, whether that's ROI or just like net new revenue goals with retention for upsells or existing customers. But yeah, revenue analytics is looking kind of end to end around what is performing and what's working for your business.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that we have to have this conversation is because, as we've talked about on the previous kind of shows, is that there's a lot of tech, right? And everyone gets so almost like so focused on technology and what technology can do. They forget that the term revenue analytics, once again, just like other terms, is not a new term. Like we've always wanted, like every company's goal, if you're a for-profit organization and profit is something that you like, then revenue is what feeds that profit. So when we talk about stuff like attribution or multi-touch attribution or campaign attribution, ultimately they're all really forms of different flavors of last touch. One looks at last touch across the life cycle, but what is the main focus and what's going to help organizations grow is really trying to focus on how do we capture revenue as the primary focus and make decisions based off on that.
Yeah, I agree with that, Raja. Like I feel like oftentimes with like attribution, people are like really focused in on hitting particular like stages and goals around like, okay, like how are we driving MQLs or things along those lines, which are, those are good KPIs still to have for a marketing org. But when we think about revenue analytics, like this goes beyond just marketing, right? Like we're also now taking into account sales and finance and seeing how all of the departments and how all the teams are actually contributing to revenue versus just, what are those channels and campaigns that are generating touches.
Yeah, and it's also the most sustainable way for long-term growth, right? Like if you look at all the products that are out currently on the market, generally we think multi-touch attribution, and the reports that we always get asked by our majority of our clients is, what are all the things that someone is doing? They don't say, let's
Yes.
now look at all of the last touch things that someone is doing and let's weight those accordingly. And I think that is an initiative by itself. When we talk about very specifically what revenue operations brings to the table at a company is the holistic approach of cross-department alignment, right? And if we're not looking at it across departments, meaning that we're not, even with, and Kelsey, you probably can talk to this a lot better, is that, sales and marketing still fight over what is considered last touch. Is it the demo? Like, is it that one or is it the webinar that led to the demo? Now, which one's going to get more allocation, more weighted scores, or, whatever different kind of forms of, not arguments, I guess, discussions that they have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there can be gaps sometimes between marketing and sales in terms of who gets credit, right? And not necessarily fights or arguments over it, but certainly, some people feel like certain actions are more meaningful or drive a more positive outcome. And ultimately, it's like it shouldn't come down to like fighting for credit, but rather like, okay, how as a company are our actions contributing in a meaningful way? And attribution is great for understanding kind of like those moment in time efforts that are driving specific points within the conversion of the funnel. But revenue analytics, like you're looking end to end to understand, okay, what is actually moving the needle here?
Yeah, because one of the fail-safes with attribution, one of the counterpoints and the selling points, and there's different ways you can obviously like spin any kind of marketing software, is that moment in time part that you were just talking about. that is not indicative of buying behavior. That is indicative of them performing an action that we are saying that this action occurred and then something happened which resulted in an opportunity being opened.
So when we think about revenue analytics, and again, just kind of taking a step back here, why is revenue analytics and RevOps in that sense important to look at holistically? Like, how does it impact things holistically from a business performance standpoint, and why is that important overall from your experience?
Yeah, I think it comes down to being like the most informed, right? Using revenue analytics and like working with like the RevOps group to do this, like this is going to allow you to make the best use of your data to then make informed decisions for as it relates to like how do we want to strategically run certain efforts within the company next year, or like how do we want to adjust like budget and strategy around like sales and marketing. Like, okay, we're seeing this like end to end in terms of our revenue targets, and then based on the analytics, like here's how we did according to these initiatives that we ran in this year. And so now that we're looking at this from end to end, we can iterate and drive efficiency in a way that maybe we hadn't been able to do previously because we lacked the visibility into that. And so I think it comes down to using the data to make smarter decisions, right? Like I think that's really what it always comes down to. I think oftentimes like people will like blindly say like, oh, like this should be what our like marketing mix is because that's how everyone's always done it or what have you. But it's like, why would we blindly say that that is the way it needs to be done because it's always been done that way versus using the data that we have available to us and then making operational efficiencies or making changes in strategy according to what actually drives results.
And I think that's one part that I think you said, Kelsey, which holds very, very true, right? It holds very true to the sense of decision making.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about attribution, we talk about point in time kind of items that we're using to define a model, right? Like, and we can talk about the standard models, W, U, full path, custom, whatever other models essentially there are, is that those actions will only happen. Like, you're not going to run the same webinar every single week, right? Just like every single year.
Yeah.
So if we're saying webinar is allocating X amount of revenue, well, that's maybe only for this month. But if we talk about true long-term growth scalability, right? Everyone wants this idea of forecasting, right? Forecasting is huge. Well, you can't forecast unless you're doing the exact same thing or similar to it over and over again. So how do you forecast that at that point? Right? Like, how do you add that to the equation? And the main thing with revenue analytics is really trying to solve is that question. And that is the primary questions that any of the C-suite, the board members, anyone in revenue operations is really trying to answer is like, how do we properly forecast revenue and opportunity and make this a long-term plan rather than short-term attribution to things that are occurring every single month, right? If you're still, just because you're doing a webinar and all of a sudden your attribution tool or your, attribution initiative says we have 55%, attribution allocated to people, attending a webinar or maybe registering for a webinar or whatever your mile marker and points are, doesn't mean that you're just going to increase the amount of webinars that you do every single month because that's what the platform is saying, right? Like that's not what it's saying. That's saying that what people are interacting with, not necessarily related to overall revenue and growth.
No, and I think that too then allows for like kind of like trend analysis, right? And creating some sort of like benchmarking within your reporting. I like oftentimes a question that has come up when looking at like attribution and reporting is like, what's the golden path? And it's like, okay, like we want to know like what the golden path is for like a user or a buyer to go like from end to end of the funnel, like if they had this as their touch for the opportunity creation and this was what drove them to like become a close-end deal, like how do we replicate that? And it's like you can't necessarily force behavior on anybody. I know personally I'm very defiant, and if I'm like told to do one thing, I'm going to do the opposite typically. But I think like with revenue analytics, it kind of gets out of that mindset of like how do we like make people do this or like engage with specific channels. And it's like, okay, now let's just like look end to end, like year to date, like what where are we like seeing the money come from? And then are we seeing specific trends at like certain times? Like, is there seasonality to this data? Like, did we launch new products and stuff like this? Or like, did we do some new case studies? And so you layer additional data points on top of it, then to start to understand like, okay, how do we continue to drive momentum based on how we're seeing people interact with us?
Yeah, and I think that's once again like all of these things. And one thing I want to clarify, like revenue analytics, just in a nutshell, isn't like a platform. It's not like a product that you purchase, right? It's the idea of looking at data in a completely different, I won't say in a completely different way, but in a way that is focusing and highlighting on all the touch point channels, campaigns, everything that everything that your marketing team and your sales team is doing holistically across the board. And not saying we're going to pick and choose activities that we like because one sales team is aligned with, because the sales team is aligned with certain activities. Maybe they hold demos more valuable. Well, guess what? You're going to have to now allocate appropriately to demos. It's no different than just picking and choosing. Of you have an opportunity for $1,000. Sales says, well, the demos are what sold the deal, and we want $500 of it. It's the same concept. Now it's just a percentage that we're applying to all of those touches, but we're still talking about it. Like we're not letting the data speak for itself. So just know, like the term revenue analytics is not a product. Like it's not like a multi-touch attribution tool, but it's the idea of looking at data through the lens of what revenue operations as a job or as a role is trying to do. It's trying to align marketing, sales, customer service, and with revenue analytics, now we add finance to the mix, right? Like we're adding in all of these components and looking at it holistically rather than just picking and choosing. Because I think that's one thing I've noticed a lot this year is that since everyone has this multi-touch attribution initiative, when the data says an action isn't as important as it is, we argue it, or well, not argue it. What do we say? We red flag it, right? Like we challenge it every single time. We're like, no. Those things that we are doing are so important, and it used to be like this, right? And I think that's where the mix is now. Is that we're kind of in the same boat. Like whether it's a multi-touch attribution initiative or just reporting or last touch in general.
It's very interesting too, like the number of people that have purchased multi-touch attribution platforms that still only look at single touch attribution. And so they're still looking at like, okay, like I only care about this engagement. And that's what we're going to put all of our credit against and say, like, this is what's driven revenue. But it's like, wait a second, like even with like you have a tool that's going to show you like multiple points of engagement, but it's like even beyond that, like you have additional data, you have further insight into knowing and like, and that there were multiple, points of engagement that actually like impacted the deal, that drove the revenue, that contributed to ROI or what have you. So it's like kind of, you have to like remove the blinders, if you will.
Yeah. And I think as a RevOps leader or someone in revenue operations, that's what you have to look at. You have to be able to you have to be able to not look at what is being shown, but looking at all of those cross-functional things. And you just can't do that with standard attribution. I think, Kelsey, you mentioned, everyone still uses attribution tools from first touch, right? From a first touch perspective. Well, I mean, I think attribution tools are still using first touch and last touch at just different points of the life cycle. Like, hey, when someone was created, what is the last thing that they did? Well, now that is part of your attribution. We're just now shifting the money wherever we want to show what is more important, what is less important when it comes to attribution. And that's why I think attribution is just another flavor of the month at this point, right? It's more defined.
The last 5 years.
5 years? Well, I mean, that's how long it takes strategy, right? Like think about ABM. Like account-based marketing wasn't a quote-unquote initiative and or strategy up until someone defined it. And when we define multi-touch attribution, over time, it was nice at the very beginning, like just like lead scoring was nice at the very beginning, right? Like everyone had 100 scored. That means they're marketing qualified. Now scores don't mean anything, right? Like scores don't define anything. It's just measures engagement. And I think we're at that cusp with attribution, especially with revenue operations. We're at that cusp that multi-touch attribution is also kind of now there's holes that people are finding, and we're just trying to fill those gaps rather than actually solve the bigger thing. It's like, okay, multi-touch attribution tells you a piece of the puzzle. It is not the entire puzzle.
I agree with that. Like I do think like multi-touch attribution like has a purpose and like works for a lot of people. Some people aren't maybe like leveraging it to its full capabilities, but I think ultimately, like as people use a multi-touch attribution tool for longer, it's like they almost like graduate out of it, right? Like the more sophisticated and more mature that they become in their reporting and their understanding of the data, it's like then they start to see, as you said, the holes. Like what are we missing? Like what are we not factoring in? And that's why you are seeing more people go into this like cross-departmental collaboration because it's like, okay, well, we should have been factoring in sales, like we should have been factoring in customer success, we should have been doing this, that, and the other. And so that's why revenue analytics has become more popular because it's like we're filling those holes that we had kind of accepted now with more information that's going to allow us to more accurately understand the
Yeah.
data.
And I mean, like, that's how long it usually takes, right? It takes like 3 to 5 years for people to catch on to what quote unquote like the game is, right? Like even us as end users, right? Like we know we're getting scored when we fill out a form, right?
Yes.
We know that when we're doing activity somehow, like we know when we get an email as a marketing ops person, or in the marketing realm, we know, oh, this email was probably triggered off of like X amount of stuff that I did. And that's the same thing as you present all of these things up the ladder as much as possible. And once you get to the C-suite, they're like, wait a minute. Like over time, they're like, this doesn't seem right. Like this is not accurate because we cannot have, for XYZ reasons. Like the last time I presented like a report for attribution, someone said, well, is website visits really the number one allocating touch that we should be spending money on? And the idea is that's an action that someone does based off on no matter how many marketing activities. And people are going to your website. So once again, if someone opens an opportunity and the last thing that they did was attend a webinar, but the opportunity wasn't open and they went to the website, well, guess what? Now we have to manually allocate attribution to that webinar.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting like to see over the next like couple years like how people shift their strategy as it relates to attribution and analytics, just based on the questions that are going to be coming down from the C-suite.
Yeah, and I think that there's this one CMO that I talked to, like they didn't even want to follow attribution. They're like, at this moment in time, we just need to know last touch. What is the last thing that they're doing right before the opportunity? And that's it. Like we don't care about anything else because we would just want to look at the most direct forward revenue related results. And if that's dinners or demos or in-person meetings or whatever it is, then so be it.
Yep.
So with all this in mind, we're talking a lot about attribution and maybe the potential gaps that could exist if someone's purely relying on that. But what can we tell people if we were to give them a revenue analytics 101? If you're using these platforms or if you're using these tools, here are some things that you can do to up your revenue analytics game in the next X amount of months or years.
I feel like it like comes down to like having a clear understanding of KPIs, right? And then how and like an understanding of how you're going to capture data to report against those KPIs, right? So like it's like what are the steps for revenue analytics? It's like data collection, right? Where's the data coming from? Like and where like what systems are we, gathering all that information from? Is this Google Analytics? Is this your Salesforce? Is this automation? Is this CPQ? Like where are the platforms that are going to feed the data for revenue analytics? So like step one is just like making sure we have an understanding of like, okay, what is the data that we want to report against and where is it going? Where does it exist? And then how do we make sure it is digestible, I think is probably the best way to say that. I think oftentimes with like revenue analytics data, like you've got a lot of information available to you, but it comes down to making sure that the data is also usable. So that might be, pulling all this information into like a data warehouse and going through like data transformations and things along those lines. And then from there, it's like starting to measure the data, starting to look at the data. So, you might use like a BI, like I would probably recommend like a BI platform, right? Because it's like you've got the BI platform, like a Domo or a Power BI connected to your data warehouse. And then from there, you're starting to create visualizations and reports around your specific KPIs. So, whether that's, very simply, like I want to understand revenue trends month over month, or I want to look at our impact against retention or something along those lines. Like there's a million different KPIs. It just kind of comes down to like what business questions need to be answered for your company. And then using like a BI platform, I think oftentimes makes it a little bit easier to then create that visualization. And then it's like, cool, now you've got the reports. What do I do with that? And you have to start to like understand the data.
Like when is an org ready for a BI platform? Right? Because that's the other thing. Like there's certain people that are like from a price point perspective, like, hey, if you're if you're a starting org, like you really just need to focus on like last touch conversion, the activities that are generating leads and stuff like that. But if you're gone down the path of multi-touch attribution, you're finding yourself gaps, really the next step for you is a BI platform that can consolidate the data and then do all the things that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Agree? Disagree? Or
I agree. I don't think that there's ever a scenario where like a company isn't ready for a BI platform though. Like you
well,
might
money wise, right? Like money
money,
wise,
but because think about it, like there are so many BI platforms out there these days, and they run the gamut in terms of like price and functionality, right? And
yeah,
so like with anything, like with revenue analytics even, right? Like we're graduating in our data and our understanding of the information, like as we mature, right? As a company, as our strategies shift, as the channels we invest in kind of develop. And so it's like,
yeah,
even as the teams that we have within the company kind of build out, right? Like we've all worked at like startups, right? Like,
yeah.
and when it was like everyone had 12 hats that they wore, and like you were both a salesperson and the support person and the customer success manager and this, that, and the other. And it's like, great. Like, even at a small stage startup, like maybe you can't afford like the Power BIs or the Tableaus or whatever, but like there are BI tools out there that will allow for the visualization that you need. And if all else fails, it's like, okay, maybe we can't get to that point, and like we can use Google Sheets. We can use Excel. Like that's not my favorite answer, to be honest
Yeah.
with you, but like it's there, right? Like it exists like as a more accessible tool. And so, yeah. And then I think, yeah, like as I was like saying earlier, like it's like revenue analytics, right? Like it's a matter of like getting all the data in one place, collecting it, right? Like I've just had a call today with somebody where they're like, I'm using this, and this platform. And like, then we come out and we create these reports. And I'm like, great. Like, where are you doing this? And they're like, in our data warehouse, and then using Power BI. And I'm like, music. I love that. That's so good to hear. So it's like getting the data, then starting to build out visualizations or reports to then analyze that data, and then starting to like understand it and interpret it. Like that almost is like the hardest part of it, to be honest with you, because it's like, okay, like I'm seeing this is the output and what have you, but it's like, what does that mean for our business? So you have to kind of go back to the question of like, what are our KPIs? What are the questions that we're trying to answer? And then does that data answer that question? And what does that mean? Like, is it positive or negative? And then from there, you do something about it, right? Like I think that's what it is, right? Like
Yeah.
it's like
you try to align it, right? And I think a lot of the questions that even like when I did a lot of like back in the day attribution and multi-attribution initiatives, one of the things that was rarely asked inside those or it really even focused on is what you're saying is like what are the KPIs trying to hit? Like what are your revenue goals? Like what is your lead generation target? What is your what is your conversion percentage? Yeah, and I think all of those questions don't get asked anymore because we think that a attribution tool or some sort of tool is going to fix those, but those are equally as important to align with. And specifically talking to all the revenue operations focused people, because that's what ultimately our goal is. Our goal is to align all these different cross units and different from marketing, sales, customer service. Now it's expanded to finance, and then it's going to get expanded to other things. Is that we're looking at it at such a top level picture? Is that establishing what is your average deal size? Like, how can you measure annual contract value? And then from measuring, defining those type of metrics, like what is your ACV goal per account? Like, what should be your average deal size? Well, how are you trying to get to them? And then to Kelsey's point, relating that back into the data that you've collected and saying, these are the things that we're allocating revenue to, sure, but these are also the things that we have to do and to have to focus on to increase our average deal size. Like, to increase conversion rates. Like, these are all of those data metrics that I don't think people are generally focusing on anymore, because they think that we're just going to allocate resources and then look at a platform, and that platform is going to tell us, okay, we need to do more webinars or this or that. And that's not generally the case, right? Like, that's not how things work.
No, you kind of do have to do the legwork here, right? Of like pulling the data from the different systems and then building out the reports and everything, and then like segmenting that data, right? Too, like you might have a business where it's like it operates entirely differently in Europe than it does in North America. So it's like not everything is one size fits all in this scenario. It's like, okay, like again, what are those business questions that we're asking ourselves? And then what is how do the analytics like support answering those questions? And like, how do we need to pivot or slice the data further to then be able to understand it for like this cornerstone of our business or this specific team within the org? What have you.
I mean, let's even forget different business units or different areas or different regions. Like, the consumer buying, like the buying space of products, technology in changes quarter to quarter. Like, even currently, like I feel like it's like the most, I've been doing this for 15 years. Kelsey's been doing this for a while. There used to be trends. And when we had these products put everyone saying, hey, these are the things that you need to follow. These are the best practices. And that's how products generally kind of sell. But now if you look at the buying, if you look at buying timeframes or buying behavior of just the people that you're selling to and your entire database, it changes quarter over quarter, especially in today's market, right? Like, it's gonna be very different after the holidays. It's gonna be very different going into the holidays, right? And those are the things that we're not taking into account when we're feeding this data and letting it run for 6 months and saying now is the time to analyze. No, we should realistically be saying, did we meet? What are our targets? Did we meet those targets month over month or quarter over quarter? And now, if we didn't, what are the things that we have to do to meet them before we start changing things? Because you have to hit your goals before you can adjust your goals, right?
Yeah. In theory.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today for the Call It RevOps Revenue Analytics episode, where we dive deep into this. Thank you so much, Kelsey, for joining us. Raja, as always. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to us directly. Share this with somebody who might be interested in learning more about revenue analytics or RevOps in general. And with that being said, we'll see you next time.